Hey guys, this is National Master Kevin Yang back at it with another video. So, I said in the previous video against NiceChessD that I want to look at this endgame more in depth. When we look at this position, I think it's very important for us to recognize a few things. Number one, we have to recognize, where is the majority and where is the minority, right? So you can clearly tell I only have 2 pawns on this side, but NiceChessD has 4 pawns. I have 4 pawns on the king side, white has 1 pawn. So by establishing that, we know that, okay, black is probably going to push on the king side, but white is going to push on the queen side. And another thing to think about this position is whose pawn is more advanced. And it's sort of obvious that white's pawn is a big threat. And to be honest, rook d2 is probably not the most accurate way to start this out. What I should have done is I should have brought my king to the action first. And I think this was a move that I missed simply because I was too fixated upon getting the rook behind the pawn. Because I had this this sort of motion that this pawn was going to look really unstoppable here. But I was wrong. I could have played king to e8 after d7, king to d8, and all of a sudden, you play rook d5, I'll play f6, and I'm going to come back and take this pawn. So I could have easily stopped the pawn this way. But I chose to stop it with rook d2, and after c5, rook to e1 was the MVP move. Rook to d5, b4. So at this point, it gets complicated, right? Black needs to figure out how to stop the army. I can play b6. Which I probably could, but I didn't see it. I don't know. Maybe there was like rook to c1, but I'm really not sure because after b takes, there's king to e8. So, yeah, I mean, there were so many things. b4, I should have played b6, not a5. Should have played b6. But it's very hard to recognize these things, because after b6, you have to calculate whether you have enough time to really protect this past c pawn. So like c6, pawn takes, right? And if rook to c1, rook to d8, c7, rook to c8. So at this point, I have enough time to come and take c7. But it's hard to see it, right? Because you also have to think about, okay, well, what if I don't do anything? Right? What if I just play king to g2? Because this is a possibility, because rook takes c5 leads to d7 and rook to e8 again. So I always have to watch out for that. That's unstoppable, and I need to watch out for that. So there are a lot of things that I need to keep in mind, and clearly a5 was a very, very bad move. I don't know, I took my eyes off the road and suddenly things are not looking too hot. But after a3, I take, and h5. So, at this point, do I still think about b6? I still do. But I don't know what happens after rook c1, take, king e8. Right? There's c6, king d8, c7, king c8, and there's this move rook to c6. Right? And so at this point, I don't know. I don't know if I would like this pressure going on because I can never move to d7. And the problem with this is I can only move on this file because if I move to a5, well, there's d7 and queen. So I have to stay here, right? So I have to maybe play rook d2, play h5, and g4. I'd have to try something. And it could work, obviously. But after h5, there might be the move rook to b6. King to d7, rook to b8. And now there might be rook to c5, but then rook to d8. So it gets really tricky sometimes. I really don't know what to do. And so I didn't want to let these series of pawns roll down so quickly. So in the end, I said, I can't do anything here. I'm really powerless. I have to accept that I'm either losing, drawing, and I really doubt winning. So after b5, I said g4, king to g2. Now, the thing is, I don't think king to g2 is particularly necessary because this pawn right now is not of the essence. I mean, it is inevitably true that one day I'm going to try to maybe push here or take here, but it's important to follow through with the queenside majority. King to g2, rook to d2 maybe not best because I had b6 as I said before, but after g3, c6 was coming, b6, and our friend NiceChessD found a very good way to break through, which I didn't see, of course, and now let's look at this endgame. This endgame looks very tricky, right? It's not the smoothest walk in the park for white, because obviously the rook has to attend to these two passed pawns, but the king is in close proximity, so this was a good thing for white. But at the same time, black has a lot of very dangerous looking pawns. So NiceChessD makes a good effort in eliminating this first supporting pawn, right? And NiceChessD makes a good effort in being able to attack these pawns. h1. So I feel like after after rook to h4, king to g5, it's important to not let the king go up the board. So I would rather suggest the move rook to c4 here, simply saying, if you play f4, I'm going to take c6, nothing's going to happen here. I'm going to come and survey the back just in case if these guys are out of control, and white would be winning in that case. But after rook g8, this gave me more opportunity to work with these passed pawns. So now we look at this position. And you might be like, wait, how is this winning for white? Right? And to be honest, this is winning for white because the white rook is so annoying. f3, and now rook to c4, right? Because after king g5, just play king f1, king f5, king e1, right? King e5, and now rook g4, right? So essentially, if the king leaves, you're going to harass one of these pawns. But if king goes back to g5, well, we have to think about what else to do, right? Because you can't exactly go king d2 because g2 is going to win the game. So it's important to say, okay, you have to improvise a strategy. Rook b4, king f5, and you're like, I'm stuck. And to be honest, a lot of people get stuck about this. And the answer is one day you gotta go to maybe b8. King to e4, rook to g8, king to f4. Right? You might be like, there's no cure for this. But there is. There is because one day this is going to happen. This could happen right now. But essentially, when the rook attacks one of these pawns, or the rook attacks this pawn, the king can only defend 1, 2 pawns at the same time, right? So now the rook is preventing the king from coming here. And the king might be ready to slide in here, right? So the only move is g2. But at this moment, you slide into e1, and you slide into f2. King to e3, rook to e8, king to f4, king to f2. You're sliding into those holes. And this is the way to win this position, is you're going to slowly go from a position like this to king to e1 maybe, rook to g4 to weaken one of the pawns to go forward, because that way you can put your king in one of those holes. So it's important to create a hole for one of your kings, right? So king to e5, not rook to g4, but let's say if king to g5, king to d2 is not what you want to play to leave the pawns. You want to play rook to c8, right? Obviously, the black king is going to wander around, but here, rook to g8, because after king e3, rook takes g3, and after some move like g2, the king's going to slide into f2, right? So it's going to be how it is. So when we look at this position, king to h3, rook to c2, now I can play f2 here and get the draw, because after king f1, I bring my king into h2, and all of a sudden, king h1, g2 is very, very realistic. So white can't allow that to happen. So the move here is rook to c8, and the reason why is because, well, the king goes back to g4, rook g8, king f4, and king f1, right? And then black has to play, so let me just illustrate this. So king to f, what is it, like king to g4, rook to g8. If king to h4, you just play king to f1, right? And after king to h3, you just, play rook to f8. If g2, king to f2, king to h2, there's checkmate. So it's important to create this hole. If king to g4, okay, then king to g1. And now all of a sudden, the king cannot defend this pawn anymore, so you have to play f2 and king to g2. So it's often about creating this hole for the king and partnering with the rook in the back, making fun of this black king. So this endgame was really complex, but even here in the final position, it could have been won. Rook to b2, and here king to g4, but now king to f2. Then move the rook in the back, rook here, let's say rook to g3, pick up the pawn with check, and just also pick up this pawn as well. So hope you enjoyed that lesson on the 2 pawns versus rook and king. So king and 2 pawns against rook and king, because the rook and king often, if they are ahead of the passed pawns, it's a winning position. But if the king were, say, here, if the king were on a7, black would win the position. So it's very important that the king and the rook work together to stop the passed pawns. Otherwise, black would have no problem converting it. So hope you enjoyed. Hope it wasn't too long. It's very instructional, but it's also hard to master because it's not something that comes directly. It's something that takes practice, recognition, and realization. So hope you enjoyed it. Hope that sparked part of your curiosity. Hope that maybe you learned something today. So I'll see you soon.